The courthouse in Tampa, Florida, had seen its share of court battles, but no one could have predicted the storm that was about to unfold on this particular morning. Judge Prescott believed he could silence Pam Bondi with a fine, but he never expected her to dismantle his entire argument in front of everyone. Pam Bondi, as sharp as ever, entered the heavy wooden doors with her briefcase in one hand and adjusted the lapel of her blazer in the other. Judge Alan Prescott, who is known for his no-nonsense manner, was staring at something just below her collarbone, a simple gold cross, rather than at her face. The air in the courtroom shifted to a quiet stillness, and then, in a tone as sharp as a gavel strike, Prescott cleared his throat and leaned forward, reminding Miss Bondi that this was supposed to be a routine hearing that she could argue in her sleep. Pam hardly blinked, saying, "Your Honor, you're wearing a cross that violates the neutrality of the space. You'll need to remove it or face a fine." A murmur went through the few people present, and the bail shifted uncomfortably. The clerk glanced at the judge a few times before turning back to Pam. This wasn't the first time a judge had attempted to exercise unusual control over his courtroom, but it was the first time anyone had considered hiring a lawyer. Pam didn't move over a necklace. "I apologize, Your Honor, but my cross is no different than a wedding ring or a locket with a family photo inside." Judge Prescott sighed, seemingly growing weary of the conversation. "Either take it off or I'll have to impose a fine for violating courtroom neutrality for the first time in her career." Pam Bondi was fined for wearing jewelry, not for misconduct or a procedural infraction. She didn't remove the cross. Instead, she folded her hands over her briefcase, her expression cool. "Before we proceed, Your Honor, I'd like to formally address this issue." Judge Prescott raised a brow and said, "Yes, I'll be filing an objection, and would like to state my argument on record." The judge smirked and looked at the wall clock. "Miss Bondi, I'm sure." The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, and the room became tense, not because of a legal battle over a contract, but because an experienced lawyer had just questioned a judge's authority. "You know that this hearing is about a business dispute, not your personal grievances," and Pam didn't flinch. "I also know that the First Amendment doesn't take a recess for personal opinions that got his attention." The judge exhaled and rubbed his temples, but before he could reply, Pam was already reaching into her briefcase. She wasn't just going to argue, she was going to dismantle his entire premise, but Judge Prescott didn't realize how deep a hole he had started digging for himself. Pam knew she was walking a fine line, but there was no way she could back down. "You're suing me for wearing a cross, so let's break that down legally, shall we?" Judge Prescott sighed with Ms. Bondi. "I don't have time for theatrics." Pam didn't blink, and neither did I, Your Honor. "But what I do have is a firm understanding of constitutional law." The judge leaned forward, his fingers laced together, as if bracing for whatever was about to happen. "I don't have time for theatrics," said Pam, carefully placing a single sheet of paper from her briefcase on the table in front of her. The courtroom was silent. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys, and the bailiff barely moved in his seat. Judge Prescott exhaled slowly, saying, "This courtroom operates under my authority." Ms. Bondi Pam nodded that it does, but that authority is not above the Constitution. She tapped the paper in front of her. "You're accusing me of wearing a cross, but tell me, Your Honor, what legal precedent are you basing that on?" Judge Prescott's jaw tightened slightly as she picked up the paper. "Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969, a landmark case that established that people do not lose their constitutional rights when they enter a government institution, whether that be a courtroom or a school." The judge scoffed. "You're an attorney, not a law professor." Pam smiled, but it was cold. The judge said that personal religious expression is protected under the First Amendment, especially when it does not disrupt proceedings. The Supreme Court ruled in West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, 1943, that forcing people to remove or conceal symbols of personal belief is a violation of their First Amendment rights. Pam put the paper down, but he knew that everyone in the legal field did. Now, Your Honor, would you like me to continue, or would you prefer to reconsider that fine? The judge's fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair, and he knew he was cornered. A few silent gasps erupted in the courtroom as Judge Prescott's face darkened sufficiently. His voice was sharp, but his authority was slipping. Pam tilted her head, saying, "With all due respect, Your Honor, I'll stop when I receive a legal justification for this fine because so far I haven't heard one." However, his pride wouldn't allow him to concede that this is not a religious debate just yet. The judge then turned to the clerk. Judge Prescott's face was still unreadable, but there was no mistaking the way he shifted in his chair. He had expected a quiet compliance rather than a full-blown constitutional challenge. The air in the courtroom was no longer just tense, it was electric, and Pam could feel it. Mark, the finest pending review, smirked. I'll take that as a temporary victory, but she wasn't done yet. The real fight was just getting started. Pam's lips pressed together. You mean like the wedding bands worn by half the attorneys here, or the lapel pins you allow on government officials? Prescott's jaw tightened, and he didn't let up. The judge now had two options: either stand by his feeble defense and risk humiliation, or find a way to backtrack without losing control. Prescott wasn't one to back down easily, Ms. Bondi. He started off measuredly. Or let's discuss the occasion when you permitted a defense lawyer to wear a pink ribbon to raise awareness of breast cancer during a trial that you had no problem with. A few silent mutterings started among the witnesses, and Prescott glared at them, but the damage was already done. Pam had just revealed his selective enforcement, and she sat back with her arms crossed. Tell me, Your Honor, why this rule only applies to my cross? Prescott's fingers curled around the edge of his desk, trapping him. Pam didn't need to boast. She simply allowed the silence to last long enough for everyone to comprehend the situation's reality before she delivered the final blow. If you stand by this fine, Your Honor, I will be filing an appeal before the ink dries on the ruling. And everyone in that courtroom could see it. He had enforced an unwritten rule based on personal bias, and now it was collapsing beneath him for the first time since the hearing started. And I promise that this case will make headlines when it does. She allowed the fact that a sitting judge had found a woman for wearing a cross in court to sink in. I'm sure that the higher courts would love to comment on that precedent. Prescott's nostrils flared. His pride and ego were engaged in a battle against harsh reality, but Pam didn't turn away. The longer he put it off, the more obvious his error became. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he let out a sharp breath and said, "The fine is rescinded." Pam grinned and thanked him, but this was more than just a fine anymore. She had sent a clear message that Prescott would not soon forget, but the fallout was just getting started. The judge's words, "The fine is rescinded," should have put an end to it, but the courtroom was also a spectacle, and everyone in attendance had just witnessed something they would not soon forget. Judge Prescott shifted in his chair, straightening his papers as if he could physically erase the moment, but Pam knew better than to ignore the deafening silence. The court reporter hardly looked up from her keyboard, but even she knew that this transcript would circulate beyond this room. The clerk, who had initially looked uneasy when the fine was announced just now, gave Pam a quick glance, almost as if impressed. Pam steadily straightened her blazer, leaving the small gold cross exactly where it had been throughout the entire time she had won. However, she needed to ensure that this wasn't just a personal triumph. It had to mean something more. She turned to her client, a middle-aged business owner who had been the real reason for this hearing. The man gave her a barely concealed nod of respect, his faith in her only growing stronger. Outside the courthouse, the response was immediate. Within an hour, a local news website had published the headline, "Florida judge attempts to fine attorney for wearing a cross, but it doesn't go as planned," and a reporter who had been covering an entirely different case in the same building learned of what had just transpired. Pam's phone buzzed, and then repeatedly, colleagues, former law school classmates and journalists wanted to know what had happened. Pam wasn't naive, though. She knew that cases like this had repercussions, whether she intended them to or not. This wasn't just about one judge and one lawyer anymore. It was a challenge to a precedent that hadn't been stated yet, but it's possible that other judges would try something similar. Pam wasn't interested in headlines or media spin, though, and she had a bigger picture in mind for her next move. By that evening, the story had taken on a life of its own. A prominent legal commentator on a conservative news station mentioned it during a panel discussion on social media, and heated debates broke out. Would lawyers feel pressured to leave their personal symbols at home to avoid confrontation? Would this moment embolden others to push the boundaries of courtroom neutrality in ways that targeted personal beliefs? Pam wasn't going to have allowed that to happen. Pam sat in her office, watching the conversation unfold on her phone between those who backed the judge's positions and those who saw her defiance as a crucial stand for constitutional rights. A producer from a national news network had already contacted her, asking for an interview, so she exhaled slowly and rubbed her temple. She had spent years defending her clients in high-stakes cases, but this felt different because it wasn't about criminal defenses or corporate disputes. Rather, it was about personal freedoms. As she left the courthouse that day, she could sense that Judge Prescott wasn't finished with her yet. He may have revoked the fine, but there was an unspoken challenge in his expression before he banged the gavel and dismissed the session. Pam wasn't sure what form it would take, but she knew this battle was far from over and expected some fallout. Several emails and possibly a few phone calls from co-workers weighed in, but what she didn't anticipate was how quickly things got out of hand. By the time she arrived at her office the following morning, her assistant Lauren was already there, looking worried. She held up her tablet, and Pam took it, scanning the screen. The Florida Bar Association had just released a statement that was neutral in tone but clear in its implications. Pam exhaled slowly. This wasn't just a remark, it was a warning. The words "respect the rules" set forth by presiding judges weren't just a general statement. They were a signal that the legal world was close-knit. Judges have the right to maintain decorum in their courtrooms, while attorneys are allowed to express themselves freely. We trust our judicial system to handle these matters with fairness and integrity. Lauren put the tablet down and said, "This came out today." Lauren nodded an hour ago. Pam wasn't surprised the legal community was small. Word had traveled fast, and Prescott clearly wasn't taking this lightly. The Florida Bar rarely commented on courtroom disputes unless they had reason to believe a situation was getting out of hand. So Prescott wasn't just bitter, he was already working behind the scenes to rally institutional backing. She said carefully, and Pam looked up, her expression unreadable. Lauren then handed her another document, this one printed on Pam's skim. Her pulse was steady for the first few lines, but her mind was racing because her lawyer, Pam Bondi, behaved in a way that disrupted court proceedings, challenged judicial authority inappropriately, and engaged in behavior that was unworthy of a court officer. Pam couldn't help but laugh a little, without humor. She shook her head, which is rich, Lauren sighed. It's retaliation, plain and simple. Pam leaned back in her chair and tapped her fingers against the armrest. Prescott wasn't just seeking revenge, he was also trying to set an example after losing. In his courtroom, by filing this formal complaint, he was attempting to change the story so that he was no longer the judge who overreached his authority, but rather he was portraying himself as the one who did so. Pam had witnessed this move before. It was a common tactic to turn the accuser into the accused and reframe the story so the real issue got buried beneath bureaucracy and technicalities. He wanted to make her look like the reckless lawyer who had challenged him just for the sake of challenging him. However, she wasn't going to let that happen. What's the process on this? If Prescott was hoping to bury her in paperwork and quiet pressure, he had miscalculated because this wasn't going to be handled quietly. It was going to become very public. She asked, "Shifting gears already?" Lauren exhaled. "You'll have to respond within 10 days if the complaint moves forward. They could conduct a formal review." Pam nodded slowly and she hesitated. "Who oversees that review?" "A panel consisting of judges and senior attorneys." Pam nearly smiled. Lauren watched her to see how she would respond. "What would you like to do?" Pam took a deep breath and then reached for her phone. If Prescott wanted to play games, let's play. She scrolled through her contacts. 10 steps ahead of her, Prescott assumed she would defend herself in a private hearing with nothing more than a gentle reprimand and move on, but he didn't realize who he was dealing with. Retaliation was most effective when it occurred in the shadows. Prescott wanted to handle this quietly, using the system against her while keeping the public in the dark. She wasn't about to let that happen, so she checked her phone, found the contact she needed, and pressed call. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered, "I need you to listen carefully, Lisa. A judge recently filed a formal complaint against me for disrupting courtroom proceedings, but what really happened was that he tried to fine me for wearing a cross, and when I stood my ground, he backed down. Now he's using the system to punish me instead of Lisa, who was silent for a moment. She had previously covered some of Pam's biggest cases, and more importantly, she wasn't afraid to go after judicial overreach. You're telling me that a sitting judge is trying to sanction you because you called out his abuse of power," she said sharply. Pam smiled. "That's precisely what I'm telling you." Lisa didn't hesitate. "I'm running this." Pam leans forward. "I need it on record before they try to spin it. Once it's public, Prescott won't be able to twist this into a quiet disciplinary issue." Lisa was already on it. "I'll have a segment up by tomorrow and I'll make sure legal analysts weigh in." Pam hung up, sensing that things were starting to move in her favor, but she wasn't finished yet. She turned back to Lauren and drafted a public statement saying, "I want to make my position clear before Prescott and his allies try to muddy the waters." Lauren nodded. "You want to frame this as judicial overreach?" Pam shook her head. "Do you want to frame it as an attack on personal rights?" Pam exhaled, gathering her thoughts. Prescott had been counting on silence, but now the nation was about to learn exactly what he had done. Pam didn't have to wait long to sit down with her coffee. If this judge believes he can punish me for standing up for myself, imagine what he's done to people who don't have a platform. Lauren's expression hardened. "I'll get it done." When she woke up the following morning, her phone was already ringing non-stop. News outlets had picked up Lisa Reynolds' segment overnight, and social media was ablaze with the headline, "Florida judge attempts to punish attorney for wearing a cross, now he's under fire." The story wasn't just being covered by conservative outlets. Legal analysts from all over the place were weighing in, and a Georgetown constitutional lawyer went on live television to call out Prescott's reasoning. The Florida Judicial Review Board announced that, as a result of the media attention, They would be reviewing Judge Prescott's conduct to determine whether his ruling had violated judicial ethics. Pam leaned back in her chair and exhaled, realizing that this was no longer just about her, but about all attorneys. This was a blatant overreach that has no legal standing. Another well-known attorney posted a thread explaining how Pam's actions had exposed a dangerous precedent that needed to be addressed. Prescott was outside the courthouse with cameras flashing around him and his expressions rigid. His statement was too brief for someone attempting to defend himself, and I have always upheld the integrity of this courtroom and the actions taken. Lauren entered the room holding up her phone, and all the defendants and people who had ever entered a courtroom wondered whether their rights could be taken away with a judge's stroke of a pen. You're going to want to see this. The Judicial Review Board had a decision to make, and if they ruled against Prescott, it wouldn't just be a professional embarrassment, it would set a precedent that protected people like Pam from ever facing this kind of retaliation again. However, I respect the judicial review process and will cooperate fully. Pam almost laughed, but he was still trying to play that card. Lauren crossed her arms in an attempt to save face. Pam nodded and failed because this wasn't going away. He had already lost everything that mattered most, including his reputation, credibility, and authority, because every lawyer who entered his courtroom would know that this was the judge who had attempted to silence someone and lost. Pam took a slow sip of her coffee and then looked up at Lauren smarter. And we won. Oh, I know Pam put down her cup, but she hadn't just fought for herself. She had sent a message that sometimes all it takes is one person to take away your rights. If you think that standing up for your rights is important, make sure that your voice is heard. They are standing their ground to change everything. For more important, real stories, leave a comment and subscribe.